The CEO jokingly invited the waitress's daughter to play the violin, but her performance stunned everyone. Sometimes one evening can change your whole life. In a small town in New York State, in an elite restaurant, an arrogant billionaire decides to entertain the public by humiliating a simple girl. He is sure she will fail. He is sure she is not from their world. But he does not know the main thing. Behind this girl is a history that he is unable to understand. A history that is about to speak through music. The small town of Greenville, New York, lived by its own quiet rules. On its main street, there were 3 coffee shops, 1 bookstore, and a restaurant called the Glass Room, an elegant place that the city's elite chose for their special dinners and negotiations. Behind shiny glass walls, under soft lamplight, waiters in white shirts served tables with perfectly ironed tablecloths, and the chef personally decorated each dish like a work of art. Sarah Brennan, 37, had been working there for 6 years. She had no complaints. Stability, even if it was borderline, was a rarity in her life. 12-hour shifts, a constant smile on her face, restraint in the face of any customer whims. All this had become routine for her. But every evening, when Sarah finished her shift, Emily, her 14-year-old daughter, was there to greet her. Emily sat on a bench across from the restaurant, her legs crossed, her face glued to her old violin. She was almost never without it. The body of the instrument was worn by time. The varnish was worn in places. The strings often needed replacing. But for Emily, it was more than just a musical instrument. It was a connection to her mother, to a past she rarely talked about. Sarah was careful with her memories. In her youth, she dreamed of the stage, studied at the Manhattan School of Music, showed great promise, but everything changed in 1 year. An unexpected pregnancy, lack of support from her family, a break with her mentor, and ultimately a return to her hometown. She became a mother and took on the role of both parents. She put her violin in the closet and never touched it again. Almost. But one day, when Emily was 8, she found an old case in the closet. The girl handed the instrument to her mother, almost without a word. Sarah looked at her for a long time, then sat down next to her and played a simple piece. And so began the training. Evening after evening, note after note. No teachers, no music books, no pressure. All from memory. All for love. By the time Emily was 14, she could play complex classical pieces by ear. Local music teachers said she had a phenomenal ear and sense of rhythm, but Sarah refused all offers to push her daughter through local competitions. "It's not time yet," she said. Emily didn't protest. She wasn't shy, but she wasn't trying to barge in either. She lived her own life, playing, reading, sometimes working part-time at a music store, helping with instrument repairs. The night it all started, Sarah was late at work. One of her regulars, Mr. Langford, had booked the VIP room for a special dinner. He was an important man, no doubt about it. Richard Langford, the founder of the investment fund Lenford Capital, a billionaire who came to Greenville twice a year, in the spring to hunt, in the fall to close deals with local developers. Tall, gray-haired, always in an expensive suit, with a manner of speaking as if you owed him. He was known for his peculiar sense of humor and his tendency to demonstrate power, sometimes openly, sometimes covertly. For the staff, his evenings were a test. Sarah was serving wine when Langford noticed Emily peering into the room from the lobby. Their eyes locked. He nodded in her direction. "Is this your daughter, Sarah?" Sarah tensed a little but nodded. "Yes, sir." "What's that she's got there? A violin?" He chuckled, noticing the case behind Emily's back. "Yes, she plays music. Does she? Langford laughed, as if he'd heard a joke. In Greenville? Of course. Can she play anything besides the dog waltz? There was laughter around the table. Sarah turned pale, but said nothing. Why don't we have some fun? Langford continued. Let him play, right here. A little private concert. I'll tip you, by the way. A big one. He took his wallet out of his pocket, pulled out $100 bill and put it on the edge of the table. Emily looked at him silently. She wasn't afraid, but she didn't feel safe either. There was something strange in her gaze, as if she didn't quite understand what this was all about. But at the same time, something inside her seemed to accept the challenge. That's not necessary, Amy, Sarah said quietly, without looking up. I'll play, the girl suddenly answered. She came closer, opened the case, took out a violin and a bow. The clicking of the waiter's heels stopped. The conversations died down. People in the hall noticed what was happening. Well, let's begin, Langford chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Emily took a breath and put the bow to the strings. But at that moment, Sarah noticed something strange. Her hands weren't shaking. Not even a little bit. The first note sounded thin, almost uncertain. But after a few seconds, the hall was filled with sounds that were not typical for this place. Emily was not just playing. She seemed to be telling a story. The melody grew, gained strength, became more emotional. The hall fell silent. Even the cooks in the kitchen opened the door. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, and her chest tightened. Not from fear, from pride. She knew the piece. It was Meditation from Massenet's opera Thais. She had once taught it herself, and Emily played it without notes, from memory, with nuances that only Sarah knew. The girl didn't just repeat it. She put her own spin on it. When the last note faded, the audience burst into applause. But no one clapped louder than the man sitting by the wall in a gray jacket, with gray temples and an attentive, calm face. He came up to Sarah afterward and said, Miss Brennan, forgive me for interrupting. My name is Thomas Rhine. I am a producer and I run a music academy in Boston. We need to talk about your daughter. Richard Langford wasn't furious, not yet, but something inside him was definitely creaking, like a poorly oiled Swiss watch. He stared at the girl with the rickety violin, at the people clapping for her, as if she were performing at Carnegie Hall instead of in front of a bar in a city restaurant. He could hear her playing, and to his irritation, he had to admit, it was strong. Too strong. Well, it turns out you have a talented daughter, Sarah, he said after a short pause, carefully returning to his tone as the master of the situation. I didn't expect that. Really, a pleasant surprise. Sarah nodded slightly. She was already standing at the table again, as if nothing had happened. Emily moved aside and sat down again, carefully putting the violin back in its case. Langford glanced at her, then turned his gaze to the man in the gray jacket, the one who had introduced himself as Thomas Rhine. Did you say Academy of Music? Said Langford, narrowing his eyes. Rhine bowed slightly. A private academy in Boston. We teach young musicians with high potential. And I think that's exactly what I saw today. Oh, Boston, Langford said, pretending to think. What are you suggesting? A place for a couple $100,000 a year? Or is this a charity? In special cases, Rhine answered calmly, we provide scholarships, full scholarships, tuition, housing, food, everything. Emily is one of those cases. Langford grinned. He was beginning to feel the familiar irritation that came when someone tried to take control away from him. Well, you know, he said a little louder, so that everyone at the table could hear. Of course, you can give scholarships to anyone, but I have a different approach. For example, I could give the girl a real gift, a professional instrument, a teacher, solo performances. If, of course, she shows loyalty, or say, accepts a more reasonable offer. Rain looked at him with mild surprise. Sarah pressed her lips together. Thank you for your generosity, Mr. Langford, she said evenly. But for now, we'll just talk. No decisions. Langford didn't answer, but inside he was already building a train of thought. The girl was a rare gem, and he didn't like to lose something that could become a profitable asset. Why not invest? Turn her into a project, put money into her, and when she took off, he would be standing next to her. Because he was the one who discovered her. Not that old man from Boston. Later, when the guests had left and the restaurant was empty, Richard approached Sarah and spoke without unnecessary pathos. Sarah, I understand that you are used to coping on your own. Respectfully. But you and your daughter are not the kind of people who can afford to refuse good offers. I am not your enemy. On the contrary, I am offering help. You want to buy my choice, Sarah said quietly, or buy my daughter. He chuckled. You can only buy what is being sold. Everything else is a matter of time and circumstances. Sarah wanted to answer, but suddenly Emily appeared next to her. We're not for sale, she said simply. And we're not afraid. Langford looked at her, held her gaze. He was smart, and he knew there was something about this girl that couldn't be put into a box. And that was what angered him most. That same night, in their tiny apartment on the outskirts, Sarah sat in the kitchen and looked out the window. There was tea brewed next to her, and on the table was an open laptop with the website of the academy that Rain had mentioned. Emily walked into the kitchen. Do you think it's worth it? She asked. I don't know, Amy, Sarah said without turning around. It's a whole different world out there. The level, the responsibility. Do you think I can't handle it? I think you can handle it. I'm afraid I won't be able to be there. You will always be there, even if you are far away. Sarah smiled. Her daughter was growing up, and she was talking like one. It was both scary and inspiring. The next morning, Sarah finally agreed to meet Rain separately. They sat in the same restaurant, now empty, as if time had deliberately cut out a scene from the previous evening. Rain was calm and attentive. Miss Brennan, he began, you yourself were once a student at a music school. I found that out. You had a good reputation. There was, she nodded. But it all ended, quickly. And yet you were able to pass on to your daughter the knowledge that usually takes decades to achieve. Sarah was silent for a moment, then said, I wanted her to have something of her own, something real, so that she would know that talent is not a curse. I want to offer her a chance. No strings attached. Academy, scholarship. We'll make it official. And yet, I want you to know, it will be hard. There's strict discipline there. Emotionally, it's even harder, especially for those who don't come from their circle. She'll cope, Sarah answered. I'm scared, but I believe in her. Rain nodded. Then he said, she's not just talented. She hears real music. That's rare. When he left, Sarah sat by the window. She felt the world she knew crumbling, but there was something right about it. Perhaps for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Richard Langford was calling his assistant. Find out everything about this Rain, the academy, the scholarships, and prepare an alternative. I don't like it when something is taken out of my hands. He looked out the window of his hotel room. Beyond him, Greenville, his piece of the world. But now there was a girl in it that he hadn't predicted. It made him angry. It meant he wasn't done yet. The Glassroom restaurant was preparing for Friday night as if it were a performance. New napkins, checked wine lists, shiny glasses. Everything had to be perfect. The owner of the establishment personally walked around the room, made a few comments to the waiters, then retreated into the shadows. Today, Langford was in town again. He had booked 2 rooms, the main and the small, for business meetings and light entertainment, as his assistant put it. Sarah had been working non-stop that day. The receptionist had asked her to stay on for the evening shift, knowing that Langford preferred her. The most invisible of all. She didn't mind. Frankly, she didn't care who was in the room that day. Her mind was racing with other thoughts. 3 days had passed since that evening. Thomas Rain had sent an invitation with details by email, scholarship confirmation, documents, a list of necessary certificates. He didn't push, but it was obvious he was waiting for an answer. Sarah read everything, printed it out, and kept the papers in a drawer in the kitchen ever since, as if she was afraid that saying yes would set in motion something irreversible. Emily didn't ask. She just kept playing. In the evenings, with headphones, in her room. Sometimes Sarah heard familiar phrases, Vivaldi, Schubert, Bach. Sometimes strange, modern melodies that she didn't recognize. But she felt the girl was searching for herself. That evening, Emily arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. Sarah was surprised to see her backstage, holding a case. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing," Emily replied. "I just feel like I need to be here." Sarah just nodded. She tensed internally. By 8 o'clock, the place was full. Langford appeared accompanied by 3 men in expensive suits and a woman in a black dress. He was in a good mood, joked loudly, praised the wine, and did not spare tips. "Sarah," he called after her as she placed the dish on the table. "Tell me, where is your young star? Is there a concert tonight?" Sarah didn't answer. At that moment, Emily came out of the shadows. She was holding a violin in her hands and looking straight at him. "I can play, if you want." There was silence. Several guests looked up. Langford paused for a moment, then laughed. "Well then, round 2. Excellent. I hope you're as prepared today as you were last time." He clapped his hands. The waiter turned off the background music. The room was filled with tension, as if about to jump into icy water. Emily stood by the window, against the backdrop of the city lights, in the soft yellow light. She seemed almost fragile. The violin in her hands was as old as the last time. The bow was worn, but her movements were precise, and she started playing. This time, not a classic. She chose a contemporary piece she composed herself, based on a motif from the Moonlight Sonata. It was risky, not academic, not correct, but honest. The music came in waves. At first, thin, almost transparent sounds, like a light rain, then powerful, with growing energy. Emily seemed not to notice the audience at all. She was not playing for them. She was playing to say, "I am here. I can do it. I do not ask for permission." When she finished, there was absolute silence in the hall. There was no applause, just a pause, a long one. Then the first claps, timid, then louder, then the applause of the entire audience. Someone jumped up, someone whistled. This was no longer entertaining the guests. This was a confession. Langford clapped too, but he didn't smile. He looked at Emily carefully, not with admiration like the others, with cold interest. A few minutes later, Rain approached Emily. He was in the audience too, but today, as a spectator. He shook her hand in silence and then said, "There is no choice now, Emily. You must go. This is not a request. It is a duty to what you have." Emily looked at her mother, who nodded. "We'll start filling out the paperwork tomorrow," Rain said. "I've already prepared everything." "I'll go," Emily answered calmly. Later, when the room was empty and Sarah was changing, Langford approached her again. This time, alone. "Your daughter has been noticed. She is now a valuable asset. Congratulations." "It's not an asset," Sarah said firmly. "It's a person, and it's her choice." Everyone makes a choice, but sometimes it is better to accept an offer than to regret it later. He handed over a business card. "I can give her everything she needs. The academy is good, but then there will be the stage, contracts, management. Let her think about it." Sarah didn't take the business card. "She's already thought about it, and she's chosen. Without you." He left without saying goodbye. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Emily slept peacefully. On the floor by the bed stood an open case with a violin. Next to it was a folder with documents from the academy and a piece of paper tucked into the cover. For Emily Brennan, a talent that needs to be given wings. Sarah looked at her and thought, perhaps for the first time in many years, she did not have to fear the future. The next morning, the house was especially quiet. No violin, no rustling paper, no clatter of cups. Sarah woke up first and lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Emily slept against the wall, hugging a pillow. The violin lay on the floor nearby, without a case, as if she was afraid the sound might evaporate if it was hidden again. In the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee, Sarah looked at the academy's paperwork. It sat in a neatly lined stack, as if awaiting a decision she still couldn't quite make. The offer was incredible, almost impossible. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, housing, food, health insurance. What's more, the academy would hold an audition for a scholarship to Juilliard in 2 years. It was all like a dream. Only Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. And it wasn't because she didn't trust Rain or the terms. It was all about her. When Emily came into the kitchen, Sarah was already sitting with a photo album. She rarely took it out. Emily immediately understood what was happening and sat down next to her. "Is that you?" she asked, looking at a photo of a young girl with thick brown hair standing at an old piano. She was wearing the uniform of the Manhattan School of Music. Sarah nodded. "It was the last year before you were born. I was 19. You were beautiful. Thank you. I thought then that I would become a soloist. I studied 8 to 10 hours a day. The teachers said that I had good prospects. Then it seemed that everything was ahead." What happened? Sarah didn't answer right away. Then she turned the page and showed the next photo, an informal one, taken at a party. Next to her stood a young man, tall, with a bright smile and a violin in his hands. "Is it him?" Emily guessed. Sarah nodded. "Martin. He was older. He was in graduate school. We played in a band, talked a lot. Then, everything was like in a movie. Love, mistakes, late-night conversations. When I told him I was pregnant, he was silent at first, and then he disappeared." "Are you left alone?" "Almost. My parents were shocked. They refused to help, especially when I decided to keep the baby. The teacher tried to persuade me to take an academic leave, but I already understood that I would not return. Everything began to fall apart. I returned to Greenville, got a part-time job, and then you were born. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I was afraid that you would think that you were the reason for my failure. Emily frowned. That's not true. I know. But in the beginning it was hard. I cried at night. Not because of you, because of myself, because of how I lost everything. And then you picked up the violin. And I realized that the music didn't go away. It just came to you. They sat in silence for a long time, Sarah holding the photograph and Emily holding her hand. I'm not afraid to leave, the girl said suddenly. I'm afraid to leave you alone. Sarah smiled through her tears. And I'm afraid not to let go. But you have to go. Not because you have talent, but because you're ready. I was never so brave at your age. But you still didn't give up. You raised me. That's stronger than music. Sarah shook her head. No, my dear. This is music. Just in a different form. 2 days later, Rain came to town again. This time, with contracts and an escort from the academy. He didn't go to the restaurant, but straight to Sarah's house. He smiled when he saw Emily at the door. Everything is ready, he said. We fly out of Albany tomorrow morning. We'll have a driver. It's all official, with my mother's consent. We've signed everything, Sarah said. Thank you for waiting. I never doubted it for a second, Rain replied. When he left, Sarah led Emily into the room. The suitcase was already packed. The violin lay on top, wrapped in thick cloth. On the nightstand was a letter. Sarah's hand shook slightly as she handed it to her daughter. You'll read it on the way. Just in case. I can't say important things out loud. Emily took the letter. She didn't read it. She just hugged her mother. Everything will be fine, she said. I know. That same evening, Sarah went into the restaurant. This time, not to work, just as a guest. The owner was surprised, but didn't ask. She sat by the window, ordered a glass of wine, and watched as a teenager at the next table started playing the piano. Awkwardly, uncertainly, but with sincere effort. She smiled. Once she was like that. Now she was her daughter. Somewhere in his second-floor office, Langford was scrolling through his newsfeed. One of his colleagues forwarded him a video with the caption, New star, girl with violin who blew up restaurant in Greenville. Signs contract with Rhine Academy. He closed the laptop. He was silent. And then he pressed the call button. Prepare me a list of young musical projects. And tell the lawyers. I don't want Langford's name to come up in this story anymore. Albany Airport was half empty at 6 a.m. Emily sat by the window and looked at the runways, where the lights of the steering engines moved slowly in the distance. In her hands was the same envelope with the letter from her mother. She had not yet opened it. Next to her stood a violin in an old case and a small suitcase with things. Everything she was taking with her to her new life fit in both hands. Thomas Rain was reading a printout. His assistant, a young woman named Kate, sat next to him, answering messages. No one was rushing Emily. The plane was scheduled to take off in 40 minutes. Until then, she could just be. She took out the letter. Emily, if you're reading this, you're already on your way. I'm probably drinking coffee in the kitchen right now, trying not to cry. You may look calm, But I know you. There's a storm inside you. You just know how to hide it. You're stronger than I was at your age. Smarter. More honest with yourself. You're not afraid to move forward. I'm proud of that. Remember that music isn't just a stage. It's you. It's your truth. Don't change yourself for someone else's expectations. And one more thing. If you ever lose a note, remember that I'm always there. Even if it's just in your memory. Love, Mom. Emily closed the letter. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't brush them away. She simply looked out the window, and suddenly, for the first time, she smiled. Rhine Academy was located in the suburbs of Boston, in an old brick building with a tower where the library had once been located. Stone staircases, high ceilings, classrooms with grand pianos and soundproof walls. Everything here breathed music. Not ostentatious, but deep, concentrated. The scholarship students lived in a separate building. Emily was given a room on the second floor, overlooking the garden. Her roommate was a girl named Lily, a pianist from Toronto. She immediately offered to teach her a duet. Emily was at a loss at her first lessons. Everyone was playing great. Some were technically callous, others emotional but chaotic. Her teacher, Professor Vincent, listened in silence and then simply said, "You lack form." But there are things that cannot be taught. It is not a question of technique. It is a question of the person. She worked 6 or 7 hours a day, sometimes in tears, sometimes with the feeling that she couldn't cope. But every time she felt like she was giving up, she remembered Sarah's words. "This is your truth." And she continued. 6 months have passed. Emily performed last at the Academy's winter concert. It was Rain's decision, as if drawing the final line. She came out in a black dress that Lily had helped her choose and stood at the center of the stage. In the audience were teachers, parents of students, producers, and journalists. In her hands is not the same old violin. It was a gift from the Academy when Emily officially entered, but she still kept the first one in her room. She played a piece she had written herself. The melody began with a theme that Sarah had played for her as a child. Then it moved into a complex, almost symphonic part, and at the end it returned to that same motif, but already mature, suffered, experienced. When the last note faded, the audience rose. It wasn't just an ovation, it was recognition. Rain stood by the wall and watched with a slight smile. He knew that she had passed the main test, not the academic one, but the internal one. A week later, an interview was published in a music magazine, a short article. Emily Brennan, How a Working-Class Girl Made the Room Stand Still. The subtitle is a quote. "My first teacher was named Sarah. She was a waitress, but she was the one who taught me to hear music." Sarah read this in a half-empty cafe, where she worked less often now. She spent more time working part-time at a music club for children. When she saw her name, she couldn't hold back her tears. The waitress next to her thought she was sick, but Sarah just smiled and shook her head. "Everything is fine. It's just happiness." Greenville went on with its life. People discussed local elections. New houses were built. The Glass Room restaurant changed hands. Langford no longer came. Officially, temporary suspension from business. No one was particularly bored. And somewhere in Boston, the girl he wanted to humiliate was coming out on stage more and more often. People were starting to recognize her name. Not because she had advertising, but because she had truth, and a sound that came not from an instrument, but from within. Music is not about who is louder. Music is about who is more sincere. And sometimes one evening is enough for everything to change. If you have a voice, don't be silent. If you have a note, play it. Even if your violin is old and the hall is full of indifferent faces, sometimes 3 minutes is enough for the world to remember your name.